Hi, Erin. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, Jess, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
As you know, this is the culmination of lots of conversations we've had over the last 6 months. And happily, it's led to the acquisition of 3 photographs into the Loeb's collection. So I thought this was a great opportunity for us to talk about your work, talk about these photographs in particular, and this is kind of also the culmination of your engagement with the Loeb over the last few years. You had generously lent some of your work to the exhibition Quiet as It's Kept in 2019, which sadly I didn't get a chance to see because it was before my time. But that exhibition was curated by Mary Kay Lombino, the Loeb's deputy director and curator. So this has been a long time coming, having your work come into the collection, and I'm just really thrilled about it. So thank you for once again taking the time to speak with me over Zoom.
Absolutely.
So I'm just going to dive right in because there's a lot to talk about. I thought first that we could talk about the series that these 3 photographs that came into the collection come from, which is called Black Alchemy. And it's a series that you've been working on since 2013 and is ongoing. So this is a really long-term commitment in your practice. So can you just tell me a little bit about how the series started and where the title of the series comes from?
Yeah, the the origin of this series comes from a lot of places, but it started in my studio at Rutgers. I was just finishing up an MA for photojournalism at Ohio University, and I was kind of torn between a few different things. I had gotten this 6-month internship to work at this paper in the Midwest, and then I turned it down to go to grad school. Um, and that was a big decision, but I kind of knew what I wanted to do, and it's kind of what I'm doing now. So I'm glad I made that decision. But I had been making work in the Arkansas Delta during my time at Ohio University. I was there, kept traveling back home a few times because I missed it. And that was my first time sort of living away from the Mississippi Delta, Arkansas Delta, Tennessee, Memphis area region, and started just reflecting on everything that I remembered. I came across the work of artists like LaToya Ruby Frazier and Hank Willis Thomas, and saw LaToya Ruby Frazier in the work. And then I saw Hank Willis Thomas appropriating images, and that was totally new to me. I said, this is totally different than what I've kind of been doing within photojournalism. I kind of want to do art. Um, and so that's why I made the decision to go study at Rutgers. Um, and when I was at Rutgers, I was still having those same feelings. I was not close enough to the Arkansas Delta where I could keep going back and making that work. So what I started to do was remember home. So it became more about reflection and the desire to pay homage, remembrance, and then sharing that with others. So in the studio, I began using mirrors to talk about literal reflection. And then I kept thinking about the civil rights movement, spending a lot of time in Memphis. You hear about Martin Luther King, all from elementary school all the way up to, during my time in college. So you were constantly surrounded by it, and then you look around and see your grandparents and aunts and uncles, and even my parents sort of coming to be on the edge of the civil rights movement. So um it's just a lot to think about, and I started reflecting on those conversations and not being close to those conversations anymore. I kind of wanted to create my own lens to see the world, and so that's how Black Alchemy came to be. And in terms of like the title Black Alchemy, I kind of break it down into 2 different things. So the word black represents the color black, exploring the counter narratives of blackness as race, the formal absence of light or absorption of light. Black is a metaphor. The pictures are made with black and white film as a metaphor for American history. and the colors black and white are used to focus the audience's attention. Um, Alchemy in this project, it represents the darkroom, thinking about the practice of labor, developing film. I can record and meter images in the studio, but, based on a desired outcome that I'm desiring, that I want, but I never really know what's going to happen. So, I set up my chemicals, go through that whole process. It's a process that I enjoy and a process that I need for my mode of thinking to produce these pictures. And so just like kind of the internal alchemy, but also the formal process of alchemy, putting together multiple chemicals and seeing what happens after that. And then also like the simple inquiry into like what happens if I put this and this together, combining history, individual perspective, geometric abstraction, thinking about minimalism and post-minimalism, and then also wanting a conversation with my peers and art historical images and art historical narrative. So it's a lot tied up into one, but that title Black Alchemy is the one that I settled on. Actually, one day when I was working in the studio, going through all these processes, I was at the enlarger using the overhead lamp in the enlarger to light a few images and light a few objects, photographing, just doing a bunch of stuff. And that's one of the days that I decided to call it Black Alchemy.
Yeah, I love how the title sort of captures this interplay between the subject matter that you're working with, which is so rich and multi-layered, and then the kind of form and material of photography and how you're playing with that. And this title sort of perfectly captures that like melding of the two.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's what my practice is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, there's just like, there's so much kind of captured in these two words, it seems.
Yeah, that's what I tried to go with. I was a little unsure about the title at first, but I kind of just stuck with it over the years, and I think it continues to sort of add more meaning to itself and sort of transform the more that I grow, the better that I can articulate it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you started to touch on this already, but so much of your work really directly addresses your own subject position as a Black artist in a predominantly white art world. And this is something you've spoken about in the past. And one of the works that just came into the Loeb's collection really addresses this quite head on. So can you talk a little bit about this photograph, Questions for Saul, and the references that are embedded in it, and how in some ways it represents this struggle that you've gone through to find your place as an artist?
Yeah, Questions for Saul, that's a very important image in my practice, and I'm happy that you all have acquired it for the collection, because it does have a lot of meaning for it, and it sort of talks about the narrative of artists, right? Like, how do they find themselves in the place of history? And that's something that I'm always thinking on the back end of everything that I do. Like, what is going to be the impact of this based on everything that's happened before, happening now, and what's to come? So the Questions for Saul is thinking about, Alma Thomas and Saul LeWitt in relationship to like the factual implications of their collections or the presence of their work at the Whitney. So in 1972, at the age of 81, Alma Thomas was the first African-American woman to have a solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And then I look online in their collection, and they only have one of her paintings. So for her to be the first African-American woman to have a solo show at the Whitney Museum of American Art so many years ago, and only be one piece in the collection, I just can't believe it. I don't know why that's the case. And I know there's probably all these practical things and whatever else that kind of go into that, but in a way it's still not an excuse, I don't think. But then I look at the work of Saul LeWitt, in the he's probably in his mid 30s, early 40s, come the 60s, and or in the 70s, and then but the Whitney had already been showing his work since the 60s as a younger artist, and they have over 100 of his works in the archive or in the collection, and numerous exhibitions of his. And so I'm thinking about that, like, even though Alma Thomas was dedicated to teaching most of her life, what were the implications and roles of her as a Black woman to even participate in the art world at that time period versus someone like Saul LeWitt? And then the double, triple kind of thinking about Saul LeWitt is like all the other artists that he influenced. It's no secret that he's an important figure in art history, right? And so that makes me dive deep into specific things, like, because you have an artist like Adam Pendleton, who has close ties to Saul LeWitt and the influence on the work and the Dadaist movement and all that stuff. And then even Adrian Piper, which I talked about in a recent lecture, how Adrian Piper's early work in the 60s kind of was influenced by Saul LeWitt after seeing some of his work. Mm-hmm. And then also actually meeting Saul LeWitt and him introducing her to other conceptual artists in New York at that time, right? So when I'm asking the questions for Saul in this piece, is not really I just have questions. I want to know the facts. I want to fill in the blanks because I'm very interested in history. And then people like yourself, Jess, like, how do we sit down and kind of fill in the blanks and write these histories and even make work in response to it? My job as the artist is to make work and respond to it. And I feel like someone like yourself, as a curator, can come in and add that written conceptual layer part and curate an exhibition to respond to that as well. So it's like, it's all these moving parts and potentials to happen, but that can't happen unless, I ask that question, based on what I've seen. So that's kind of how I'm looking at that. Yeah, that's kind of what I think about that image. And it's constantly growing because I'm constantly doing research on that to sort of to just add more layers to the question that I'm trying to pose with that image.
Yeah, I love this idea that your responsibility is to ask questions and kind of endlessly question the history that is kind of inherited and that you are confronted with. And for me as a curator, it's my responsibility to respond to those questions, mm-hmm. Not necessarily to provide answers, because I think these questions are going to persist. I think we'll always be trying to grapple with this history, with this kind of the inequity that you're pointing to. I mean, Saul LeWitt and Alma Thomas is one example, right? And the Whitney collection is one example, but this is, this is one of countless examples, right? And so I love that you've really sort of drilled down to this one comparison and this one example, but it really encompasses these much bigger questions, right? And that's right there in the title.
Yeah. And that's, it's just from my love of research and just kind of one day, everything is available online now, and you can preview these collections. Even if they don't have images, you can look at the list that they have, and that changes a lot of things, because maybe people were not going into these places and demanding to see the collections and who's in the collection and things like who's that. Recently the Met just released all the like 400 some odd African-American artists that they have in the collection recently. So important resources like that. And the timing is interesting, but it's just things like that, people feeling the need to sort of make those things visible and present. And then I think even from that, like you're saying, like I don't necessarily think I have to have the answers. I just kind of want to know a little bit of the facts and kind of have some conversations around it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
it.
it becomes kind of sharing a collection online, or kind of what a museum makes accessible online is part of its accountability,
Yep.
right? To its history, to the present, to artists who are working now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so that's an ongoing project, clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so Questions for Saul is also an abstract work, and I know abstraction and photography is something that's really important to you, kind of working in this abstract or semi-abstract mode. Um, so I wonder if you could just sort of describe, you started to talk about this with reflections and literal reflections of things in the studio, but can you describe a little bit how you work in the studio? Because it's a really, I think, unique process. Kind of how you're using light and shadow and projection and reflection and all of these things in the physical studio and in the dark room also.
Yeah, I absolutely can. And you just asking that um, is I'm going to revisit question 1 and 2 and then answer 3. It's all going to tie in, but because I forgot to mention something, because it directly relates to why I use abstraction.
Mhm.
What I forgot to mention in question 1 was that another thing that got Black Alchemy started is I was photographing these triracial communities in Ohio, Southeast Ohio. And that was a correlation between the Underground Railroad, the Trail of Tears, and Ohio being a free state. I'm not going to go into super detail, but that created a group of people that still exist in that region today. And I was photographing them. People can see it on my website. It's a project titled Isolated Truths. But that was basically talking about the act of passing. And then you got racial passing and sociological passing. Two of those things were going on when I was photographing people for that project. People were sort of describing, when I would do interviews, they would say, there were certain family members in my family that could pass for white, and they decided to. You'd be walking in town, you see them across the street, you couldn't acknowledge them or you'll blow their cover. So we kind of get all the implications that that talks about. So I saw this quiz from 1952 in Ebony magazine, and it says, which is white, which is Negro. That's what really kicked off Black Alchemy, because in me using abstraction, because I then became aware of the Black arts movement. And then you have artists like Frank Bowling, Jack Whitten, Mel Edwards working in abstraction, Howardena Pindell, and then going and reading their historical accounts about people rejecting them as Black artists, quote unquote, making white art, or go show with the white boys is what Howardena Pindell was told about her work, and sort of kind of being rejected from both sides for using abstraction. But if you go look at Howardena Pindell's history and why she uses abstraction, it's all tied into identity uh, at one point in her experiences from childhood. So how I correlate passing is that the assumption is being made about those artists in the 70s, or even Black artists using abstraction now, is that they're passing as a white artist.
Mhm.
And I kind of wanted to test that theory to see uh kind of how people would respond to my work. And that's still why I make images the way that I make. That is partly why Questions for Saul looks like it is. It's fully abstract, because if someone encounters that in space, will they even ask the question, am I a Black artist? They probably won't even ask anything about my identity. If they know anything about art history, the first thing they'll probably do is go to Saul LeWitt. So then therefore we have a different conversation going on. If I enter the room as the maker, then another conversation happens, right? So that's why my pictures look the way that they do. And then that's why I work with, light, shadow, projection, and installations in my studio. It's a way to work intuitively. It's a way to sort of reference reflection, and it's a way for me to have a relationship with painting. I do make paintings, but I would not call myself a painter. But I love the history of painting. I would say, if I would point to anything that's my main source of why my work looks the way it does, it's painting more so than the history of photo. But I like to engage with both of them. And then also light and how that relates to geometric abstraction. I love geometric abstraction, and I love minimalism. I really like the work of Donald Judd. I just love space and light. And I like color, even though I don't use color in my work. It's black and white mostly. But, light. I love walking down the street and seeing light, how it filters through a window or how it bends around a corner, and, how it sort of acts on different surfaces, asphalt versus brick, or concrete versus wood, or the siding of a house. And I like to take all of that into the studio, and I light my images as if I'm using the sun. This one light source, one direction, and how does that change things? Projections, I started using a projector and projecting onto like these installations to sort of break up images. And so that's sort of my relationship to like photography, and how I can take an image and add a different layer to it. Because sometimes, and I can talk about this a little later because I think one of your questions asked about it, but how I use found images, or why I use found images in my work, is because, or why I like the archive so much, it really relates back to my um, career as a photojournalist, right? I had to go out and make the pictures all the time. And for different reasons, I kind of fell out of love with that. But I didn't feel the need, and I still don't feel the need to just add these images to the canon. I feel like I can go in an archive, find an image that speaks to me and that speaks to something I'm interested in talking about here in the present. And then that's why I take it and I project it into a paper installation that I make into the studio. So I don't need to go out, or I also use some of my images from my work in the Arkansas Delta. But I'm very cautious about continuing to add to the canon of these images, especially with spaces like Instagram and internet, billions of images every day. So what's the point? That's why I'm going off a little bit, but going off course a little bit, but that's why I like the work of artists like American artists, or Sandra Perry, or someone like Trevor Paglen, really trying to question technology and digital spaces and things like that. Yeah. So I'm just looking around and seeing what's happening around me. Yeah.
Yeah, I love how much your studio practice of projecting, refracting light, reflecting with mirrors, these things become these like formal and material ways of reflecting on ideas and history, right? And you started to talk about your work in archives and kind of finding images, and then they often become sort of distorted in different ways, right, through this practice in your studio, which I find really fascinating, because there's always this material link to the way that you're approaching your subject matter, especially historical subject matter. And I love the way that your practice as a photographer, you really sort of like used light as this material. But then, of course, the material is a metaphor for the way that history is made visible to us, or kind of inaccessible to us in some ways, right, in the present. And the sort of limits of being able to really access history, or to really have a kind of presence of history in the present moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I would add to that, because I really like how you just summed that up, Jess. Who can use abstraction, who's allowed to use it? Alma Thomas and Saul Witt are both using abstraction, right? And we just talked about that. But and you see the different trajectories. But you see Alma Thomas, if you really pay attention, Alma Thomas is kind of in the art world news pretty frequently now.
Yep.
Always a new piece being bought, some kind of auction, some type of exhibition the work ends up in, and that's amazing to see. But then also going from abstract, pivoting from abstraction, like who can access archives?
Mm.
I think there's a conversation that needs to happen about, you know, because the access in terms of like some archives are not as accessible. Some of them may be private and you're not allowed to access them. Some of them may be public, but you're only able to use them in a certain way. Um, so that's interesting. I even have to think about, you know, if my work is in an archive or collection or just present online, you know, how does someone else reuse that image based on like the world that we're living in? So that's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and will be part of like some of the newer work that I hope to make in the next few months. It's talking about archives and access and really just sort of getting into the nitty gritty of how those certain archives tell certain narratives. And like you mentioned before, like the Whitney, you know, making those things accessible, making it known what they actually have. So how is the Whitney engaging with, or how are institutions engaging with the communities that they're in? And I think even more importantly, or just as equally as important, is how do they engage with artists? And how do they, one of my favorite things is when institutions open their collections to artists to curate a show or to respond to making work from. So that a lot of amazing things happen when museums and collections open up and let artists respond and curate from that. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to your future work about access. That sounds fascinating. Um, so speaking of kind of archives and accessing images in historical archives, can we talk about the other two photographs that have just come into the collection that are much more based on historical subject matter and source material?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the images, I think that the title is Georgia 1892, right? Um, and that's from Black Alchemy Volume 1. So that photograph is a charcoal drawing sitting on top of a light box, photographed in total darkness in my studio. And that really was, that image really speaks to the alchemy of the project, because I didn't know if that image would turn out or not. I just kind of metered it and hoped for the best. I really didn't know how it would come out. But I was making a lot of those charcoal drawings of like historical figures. I made a lot of outlines of some other lynchings, but it just happens that day in the studio, I just happened to make that one. You see kind of like little charcoal fragments on the bottom, little fragments as I'm lifting up the paper. You see my hand in the image. I'm starting to be present in the work. Also, that image and the specific story around the lynching is there was some kind of there was I think some type of incident, accusation, or a robbery that took place, and these three men and one onlooker ended up being lynched. And so the men's names are Jim Redmond, Gus Robertson, and Bob Addison. And that was May 17th, 1892. I think it's Habersham County, Georgia. And there's like news articles about that out that you can look up online and different things like that. But, you know, after making that image, I had to go back and sort of, you know, acknowledge the real history behind that image. And it's an infamous image on the internet, but I was trying to consider that image through the lens of Black alchemy without sort of looking at the image directly. I only wanted to look at, you know, like an outline of the image, basically. Like in a way, you can tell that maybe it's a lynching, and maybe some people can't tell at first. But I think maybe the way that I photographed it and dealt with it kind of adds like a little bit of a buffer before you have to deal with the violence of it.
Mm.
And then you have other artists. So many artists have dealt with the act of lynching. I kind of wanted to take a different approach to it. So that's a little bit about that image. And then so one of my images and in Black Alchemy Volume 2 is titled Self-Preservation. And it's of a civil war Black soldier. But I had to go back, and in Volume 1, I photographed some or projected some Civil War images in space in one of my photo installation setups. So that one is titled Untitled, Looking for Self-Preservation. And I'm always thinking about um, African Americans' positions in the military and what role they sort of played, or how much appreciation is even given to African Americans' role in all these different wars that have happened in relationship to America. Very super specific, dealing with the formation of the United States. And I often just stick to World War II, but this time, one day I was kind of doing some research, and I was like, are there any images of Black soldiers, daguerreotypes or any other types of alternative historical processes that depicted, African Americans' participation in the Civil War? Then I came across that image. How I was talking about how I use archives, I came across this man's face, and I just had to use it in an image because I'm seeing dignity, I'm seeing pride, I see pain in his face, I see sophistication in his face, and it just reminded me of myself. It reminded me of other men that I know or have met in my family. And again, I'm using an abstract setup. So you have a mirror, uh, what wooden blocks. Often what I did in the beginning of Black Alchemy is use the corner of my studio to sort of set up parameters. And so I'm kind of setting up this like altar or vigil to this Civil War soldier, kind of just paying attention to him, and reinforcing the use of photography, the tool of photography, especially at that time. So that's what I was thinking about a little bit with that. And then even on a more present day note, because I think images and histories and meanings can be added and shift and change. Like you have Deborah Willis's new book, The Black Civil War Soldier, Visual History of Conflict and Citizenship. And on the front of that book is this image of a Negro Union infantry corporal holding a Colt model 1849 pocket revolver. And that's the image that I made. And that's the image on the cover of that book is the same image that I used in 2018 for the photograph titled Self-Preservation, which is another Civil War African-American soldier. But then I was recently listening to the Modern Arts Notes podcast with Tyler Green, and he had Deborah Willis on the podcast in his episode 44. They were talking about Nick Biddle, African-American man, who's like the first bloodshed in the Civil War. And he wasn't even technically considered a soldier at that time period. So I thought that was interesting. And then again, it further reinforces how we need to kind of go back. And that's why I'm so happy about Deborah Willis's book. Is about what is the narrative and what are all the narratives and stories about African Americans' participation in the military. And we can even go back further and talk about Crispus Attucks in the Revolutionary War. I've always wanted to make an image about Crispus Attucks, and I'm getting close to it. I just haven't done it yet. But I'm still thinking about it. I've been thinking about that for a number of years. But yeah, that's a little bit about those two images and kind of what happened before and what's happening now around them.
Yeah, I love this idea of creating a vigil, like this ephemeral vigil that only exists in the studio, and then of course it gets memorialized through your photography, right? When you take a picture of that installation.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've heard you speak about that in terms of kind of your personal history or your family history too, kind of vigils to your family's past. And you talked about that a little bit at the beginning of this conversation. kind of reflecting on where you come from and your family. And I guess the last question I wanted to ask you is about the kind of self exploration or self reflection that is part of your practice and seems so important to all of the work that you're making, whether it's using kind of found family photographs as source material or things that are in more public archives, like the two images we just talked about.
Yeah, I think for me in my practice, I have to figure out, or I always have to consider like what I care about, right? And then I also have to understand art history. Um, and then out of some combination of that, still kind of come out with a unique thing that maybe only I do, or maybe that I add to a conversation with. Because I do have a list of artists that you know, I try to be in conversation with, hope to be in conversation with, and whose work that I admire and learn from and reference and all that good stuff. So I think self-awareness and self-exploration is super important, because some days I'm sitting in the studio, or since I've been at Rutgers, I sat in the studio and been reflecting on like things that I don't have access to. So how do I tap into that and actually bring them where I am physically? And that is diving through the family archive, remembering the stories that my grandparents told me, my aunts and uncles told me, my parents told me, that my siblings share with me, that my cousins share with me. And so that makes me uniquely who I am. And so I have to take that, and that all ultimately affects how I look at art history, how I look at American history, all that good stuff. And so I wouldn't be able to sort of make the images that I make without being self-aware, and then also self-education, like, um, you know, taking the time to go and look at the Whitney collection and seeing what's in there, and then looking at what they have for Alma Thomas, looking at what they have for Saul LeWitt. And so I just try to be more aware about those things, because it's important for me. I like to speak in generalizations and kind of leave things open, but I also like to speak to specific facts, or gather facts, or that's why I do a lot of interviewing of other artists. Um, it is a part of my practice, to do that, because that helps me grow as a person and kind of get an idea of how other artists think and approach their work. And it's something I take very seriously and feel is very important. But yeah, self-expression and self-education, it's a daily thing. Because sometimes, like, even between the different iterations of Black Alchemy volumes 1, 2, and 3 is ongoing, is that um, I made volume 1 during grad school, and then maybe I took like almost a 2-year break, and then I got the residency at Lightwork, and then at Lightwork there I made almost a little over 200 images while I was there, and then for a while I didn't make any new images, very sparingly. And so I think that was another year and a half, maybe even another 2 years before I seriously started to like make new images and start on the volume 3. And then since then I've made a bunch of other stuff, but those time periods in between, for me as an artist in my practice, I have to take time and kind of like think about how I've changed as a person, like living everyday life. Like, I moved a lot of different places in between making this work. I had a lot of different life experiences. I lost a lot of different family members, very, very important family members close to me. And that changed me as a person. So it changed the work and the way that I think about it. So that's why I like to talk about the personal and the private space in relation to the art that I make, because it makes me who I am. It makes me approach things the way I do. I have to stay self-aware about myself and how I'm changing to keep the work relevant for myself. And I try to take pride into keeping up with what is happening around me, because sometimes I see other artists get to things first, and then I try to see, is there room for me to add to that conversation, or do I try to add the next layer, take it a different direction? Um, so that's why I think it's so important to know what has happened in the past. Maybe enough time has passed for a new iteration of that thing to come along, but I think I also have to pay attention what's happening now. Um, because sometimes I don't necessarily want to do the same thing that another artist is doing. I either want to add to the conversation and be in collaboration, or I want to take it in another direction. Because, like I said, some artists, the artist that is next to you, maybe they get to it first, and that's the exciting challenge about art. I think it's like, who's doing what, how did they do it, when did they do it? Now, how do I do something too? And it's like a nice competitiveness that you kind of keep internally. It's kind of how I see it. But I a little bit earlier, what I was talking about when I left Ohio University and why I started to study arts, because I really got into this mode of enjoying looking at my peers' work. And I was like, I don't think I want to make images anymore. Everyone else is making these amazing images. Like, how can I get their work out there? Like, they're doing such an amazing job, and they're doing covering so many different things, from geographical locations and genres and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, I got to get this work out of here. Out there. I have to become a photo editor. I think I'll be in a much better position, or be much more interested in photo editing, as opposed to just continuing to add my images to the canon. Uh, so that's kind of how I think, and again, why I interview other artists and try to highlight other artists' work, because people are speaking. It's a lot of us, and we're speaking to a lot of different things, and um,
Yeah.
we have to acknowledge each other's influence, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this to me is why it makes so much sense to me that you did decide to become an artist, because being an artist can encompass all these different things, right? You can be an editor and a collector and a maker and, asking questions and, interviewing. And this is what artists do, right? They have,
Mhm.
most artists have a kind of research practice and a creative practice, of course, and a writing practice. And, all of these things are um, kind of combined in this identity or profession that we call being an artist, but that really includes so many different things. And your work is really a great example of that, because you're just doing so many different things as part of this practice, which is endlessly fascinating to me. So it's really hard always to end a conversation with you, because there
Yes.
are like a thousand other things we could be talking about and follow-ups that I always have. But I think for now, we're going to leave it here, and just thank you again so much for giving so generously of your time, and for allowing some of your work to come into the Loeb's collection. And I'm just thrilled to see some of it on view soon. So thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Oh, no problem. Absolutely. And I forgot to mention this earlier about that show, Quiet as Kept. That show, Quiet as Kept, at the Loeb, was directly talking about passing. I
Yeah.
think that's the most exciting show that I've been a part of in terms of a group exhibition, because it was directly talking about what I was what my work is underlyingly
Yeah.
talking about in terms of how it relates to abstraction. And I'm so excited about where my relationship with the Loeb has come to now. So it's kind of like full circle. So
Yeah,
thank you.
it's so great. Well, I'm really thrilled to get to work with you. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.